Hello and welcome to the annual Sir Malcolm Knox Lecture put on by SEPA, the Center for Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at the University of St. Andrews. My name is Theron Pummer and I'm the director of SEPA. We're absolutely delighted that this year's Knox lecturer is Tim Scanlon. The principal will be introducing him momentarily. After Principal Mapstone's introduction, Professor Scanlon will speak for roughly 1 hour, and there'll be a period for questions following the lecture. We'll end at 6:45 p.m. at the latest. And if you're an attendee, you should be able to see a Q&A icon. If you click on that, there'll be an option to type in a question and then click Ask a Question. And if you do that at any point throughout the lecture, only I will see the questions that are submitted. And I will, during the Q&A period, select questions from those that have been submitted and read them out for Professor Scanlon to answer. I'd just like to thank a few people before handing it over to Principal Mapstone. So for organizing the event tonight, I'd like to thank Colin Reed for his help with IT and Lewis Wood for help preparing things. And of course, I'd like to thank the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of St. Andrews, Professor Sally Mapstone. Some of you might know Sally's work. She's a medievalist with expertise in the area of medieval and Renaissance Scottish literature. She's the president of the Saltire Society and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I'm very grateful to Professor Mapstone for her continual support for SEPA and the Knox Lecture Series ever since her arrival here at St. Andrews in 2016. And more generally, grateful to her for her leadership during these challenging times. So without saying any more, I'd just like to hand you over now to Professor Mapstone.
So good evening, everybody. It really is a pleasure to welcome you all virtually, of course, to the 2021 Sir Malcolm Knox Memorial Lecture, to be delivered, as you've heard, by Tim Scanlon, Emeritus Alford Professor of Natural Religion, Moral Philosophy and Civil Polity at Harvard University. It is with a distinct sense of occasion that we welcome Professor Scanlon today. Let me first, however, speak to the lecture series itself and to its namesake, in whose honour we are gathered. The Knox Lecture Series was established at the University of St. Andrews by the Centre for Ethics, Philosophy and Public Affairs in 1985, with a mission to bring philosophical methods, insights and knowledge to bear on matters of public interest, and to encourage reflection on the ethical and philosophical aspects of public affairs. It is named for Sir Malcolm Knox, a philosopher of distinction and former principal of our university. Born in England in 1900, Sir Malcolm was of Scottish descent on both sides of his family, and his Scottishness was a strongly defining part of his identity. He read classics at Oxford, then worked as a secretary to Lord Leverhulme and for various aspects of the Lever Brothers conglomerate, particularly in Africa. Sir Malcolm returned to Oxford, where he combined bursarial and academic responsibilities at Jesus College, and he was later appointed lecturer in Greek philosophy at the Queen's College. In 1936, Sir Malcolm assumed a chair of moral philosophy at St. Andrews, and he spent the next 30 years here. Sir Malcolm served as deputy principal under Sir James Irvine, and upon Sir James's death in 1952, assumed the role of principal and vice-chancellor, which he held until 1966. One of his earliest interventions was to ensure that the phrase "to engage in research" was written retrospectively, when necessary, into the contracts of all lecturers and readers. In academic terms, Knox is known as the chief English translator of the writings of Hegel, whose work he first explored at Oxford under the tuition of R.G. Collingwood. His translation of the Philosophy of Right is the authoritative text published by Oxford University Press to this day, and he wrote broadly on Hegel's work and influence right up until his death in 1980. The Knox Lecture was established to memorialise Sir Malcolm and with the support of his family. In its almost 4 decades, it has become one of our foremost annual lectures, and guest speakers are chosen in acknowledgement of exceptional and sustained philosophical insights right across their career, in keeping with Knox's legacy. I would like to thank SEPA for organising this year's lecture, and in particular, its director, Dr. Theron Pummer, who is also hosting today's event, and as you heard, will chair the question and answer session later on. The precedent set by Knox is met powerfully by this evening's guest speaker, Professor Tim Scanlon, whose publication career spans nearly 5 decades and has given rise to some of the most significant philosophical thought in contemporary American academia. Tim is, of course, speaking remotely, but we hope to welcome him to St Andrews in due course, not least because his maternal grandmother was herself a Knox by name. Tim's academic life has been divided primarily between 2 institutions, Princeton and Harvard. Tim received his Bachelor of Arts from Princeton with a major in philosophy in 1962, following which he spent a contemplative year at Brasenose College, Oxford. I mean contemplative here in the personal sense rather than a philosophical one, because Tim has described that year as one spent trying to determine whether he wanted to take the plunge and become an academic, which he felt at the time to be, I'm quoting, a very strange sort of life. Tim's chosen path has been a fruitful one, but I would be fascinated to know whether the academic world has lived up to its early promise of intriguing strangeness, or whether that impression has been ameliorated for Tim by his immersion in some of the greatest academic institutions of our time. Deciding, in his words, that philosophy was something that he couldn't give up, Tim moved from Oxford to Harvard in 1963, gaining his PhD in philosophy in 1968. Tim reverted to Princeton for his first academic post as an assistant professor of philosophy in 1966 and as an associate professor in 1972. Tim was later appointed professor of philosophy at Princeton in 1977 and moved to Harvard in 1984. After 4 years at Harvard, Tim was named Alford Professor of Natural Religion, Moral Philosophy, and Civil Polity, one of Harvard's oldest and most prestigious endowed chairs, first established in 1789. Tim's early attraction to philosophy arose from an interest in logic and the structure of argument, a pursuit which manifests in his PhD thesis and early articles, such as the consistency of arithmetic via Herbrand's theorem, published in 1973. This initiation is, however, somewhat surprising, given Tim's modern eminence in moral philosophy and the scope of his publications in this area. Between 1974 and 1981, Tim co-edited 5 books with his colleagues Marshall Cohen and Thomas Nagel, all published by Princeton University Press. These volumes, which include War and Moral Responsibility, published in 1974, The Rights and Wrongs of Abortion, that same year, and Equality and Preferential Treatment in 1977, demonstrate a keen interest in bringing philosophical insights to bear upon contemporary challenges. Tim co-edited a 6th volume, International Ethics, in 1985. Tim's further publications have consolidated his ethical investigations, including through his first of 5 monographs, What We Owe to Each Other, published by Harvard University Press in 1998, and in which Tim establishes his moral theory of contractualism. What We Owe was a landmark publication, and I would be remiss not to mention that the work is a foundational text for the seminal NBC comedy The Good Place, which repeatedly takes Tim's inquiries into human relations and the obligations inherent therein as its starting point. Given The Good Place's standing as one of the foremost philosophical entrees into pop culture of the century thus far, Tim's prescience within it speaks powerfully to the influence his ideas have already had on both academic and cultural thought. Tim's subsequent monographs push his ethical inquiries further, including in The Difficulty of Tolerance, Essays in Political Philosophy, published by Cambridge University Press in 2003, and obviously resonant with today's subject. Tim's latest monograph, Why Does Inequality Matter?, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press, is yet another demonstration of his academic gaze repeatedly seeking out issues of crucial relevance to our modern world. Tim's research has been recognized with some of the highest awards it's possible to attain. Tim was named a Guggenheim Fellow in 1990, and in 1993, he was both awarded a MacArthur Fellowship and elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 1997, Tim was elected as a corresponding Fellow of the British Academy, and in 2016, he was appointed Emeritus Professor at Harvard and awarded the Launer Prize from the Launer Foundation for Analytical Philosophy. So an open invitation exists for Tim to visit St Andrews whenever such journeys are readily possible again, and I very much hope that he can join us in due course. In the meantime, it is now my happy duty to thank Professor Tim Scanlon for joining us virtually and to invite him now to deliver the 2021 Knox Lecture, Further Reflections on Tolerance and Its Difficulty. Tim.
Thank you, Principal Mapstone. A very kind introduction. I'm very sorry not to actually be in St Andrews, which I've always wanted to visit, but I hope to do so at another time. I can't resist responding briefly to your question about my decision to go into philosophy. I did it simply because I found during that year in Oxford that I found the questions so intriguing that I couldn't face the idea of putting the books back on my shelf and looking at them later as something I once did. The negative side was, as you say, worry about what kind of life would this be? Well, I was very wrong about that because it turned out to be a wonderful life. And one of the aspects of it, which is most wonderful and which I had no way of anticipating, was that it brought me into contact with such a wide range of people, a very interesting and fascinating people, both in the United States and now across the world, as on this occasion. So I keep, as it were, reaping the benefits of this choice, even though I didn't understand what benefits there would be at the time. So thank you very much. Well, my topic is tolerance, and as the principal said, I'm here referring to, trying to touch up, add to an earlier paper on that subject. Tolerance and intolerance can refer to a number of different things. One kind of intolerance is just prejudice, such as racial prejudice or prejudice against those from certain ethnic or religious backgrounds. To be intolerant in these ways is to regard certain facts about people, such as their skin color or where they came from, or their sexual desires, as reasons not to associate with them or employ them, not to want to live near them perhaps, maybe even not to allow them to vote or hold office. Facts of these kind about individuals are not good reasons to treat them in these ways, and they have good reasons to object to such treatment. But what's required in order to be tolerant in this sense is simply to give up those prejudiced attitudes, to cease regarding those features of a person as reasons for not taking the person's interests seriously. So becoming intolerant in this way can involve giving up something that intolerant people may want to have, namely a false sense of superiority. And as we know, it can be difficult to get people to do this. But morally speaking, this sense of superiority isn't something that anyone actually has any good reason to want. So from a moral or even a rational point of view, tolerance of this first kind seems to me to be costless. Being tolerant doesn't require giving up anything that one has any good reason to want. A second form of intolerance consists in laws that attempt to control the private lives of others, such as laws against homosexual conduct in private or against certain forms of religious belief and private religious observance. But being tolerant in this way requires reining in one's disapproval of this private conduct. But as long as it does not actually affect your life, being tolerant in this way, again, doesn't involve any serious sacrifice. So tolerance of this kind is what is ruled out by John Stuart Mill's famous harm principle, that harm to others is the only legitimate ground for laws restricting what people may do. I'll come back to that point about Mill. But if I think, as I did for a long time, of tolerance and intolerance only of these two kinds, then, as I said, tolerance seems to involve no costs. It would be costly for me only if I resented demand to give up a prejudice, or if I cared a great deal about what others do in private. But then I realized that there's a third form of tolerance, which the one I'm going to be concerned with in this lecture, which does have important costs and dangers even for me. People not only have good reason to conduct their lives in private in ways that are true to their religious beliefs, sexual inclinations, and cultural traditions, They also have good reason to want to behave in public in ways that are consistent with and express their values, inclinations, and allegiances. These expressions of values include such things as how they dress, what they eat, what music they listen to and play in public, what language they speak, and the way they behave toward others, for example, by holding hands and other public displays of affection. Tolerance of the kind I'm going to focus on requires us to permit these forms of public conduct. Therefore, unlike tolerance of the first two kinds I mentioned, it has risks and potential costs for all of us, because the public conduct it requires us to permit can affect what living in our society is like, in ways that we in fact have good reason to care about, and in some cases perhaps even good reason to reject, should they occur. I wrote about this question first in the 1990s in a paper called The Difficulty of Tolerance. A central idea of that paper was, as I've just said, that this kind of tolerance is difficult to accept because the conduct of others that it requires us to allow can affect the character of our society in ways we have reason to care about. But in that paper, on reflection, it seems to me that I did not make clear enough exactly what these reasons for caring about one's society are, and in particular, what follows from them. So my aim in the paper that's the basis of this lecture is to consider more carefully what those reasons might be. In that earlier paper, I gave 3 examples of the kind of concern I have in mind. The first concerned attitudes towards sex. I have no desire or interest in controlling the forms of sexual activity that other adults in my society engage in private. But the culture of American society emphasizes the importance of sex, of whatever kind, and of being sexually attractive to whoever it may be, to a degree that I find misguided and distressing. It's not that I think these attitudes towards sex are morally wrong. Rather, I just think that this exaggerated interest in sex reflects a mistaken view of what's worth valuing. It leads to a huge waste of time and effort. Worse, it distorts the relations that individuals can have with those toward whom their sexual interests are directed, and often leads them to treat these people in ways that are in fact morally wrong. In these respects, excessive concern with sex of the kind I have in mind is like excessive ambition or excessive concern with wealth or fame. These are also not exactly moral mistakes, but mistakes about what's worth valuing. They lead to a waste of time and effort, and they also distort people's relations with others, leading them, for example, to exploit and mistreat the people they work with. Now, I'd rather live in a society in which sex didn't have this kind of exaggerated importance, or what seems to me an exaggerated importance. As I say, how people lead their sexual lives in private is of no concern to me, but the public culture I've described affects me in important ways. It's present in the books, films, and music that are made available, and the objects of attention and discussion all around me. It determines what's presented to my children and grandchildren as important, cool, and worth caring about. A second example concerns religion. Some people in the United States complain that our country is ceasing to be a Christian nation, as they put it. They may object to the fact that many other religions are publicly practiced, and other religious holidays given the same status as Christmas and Easter. And they object to the fact that indifference or even hostility to religion is commonly expressed, at least by some people like me, and not seen as unrespectable. Now, I don't share their view. Other things being equal, I think at least, although I'll come back to whether I should really think this, other things equal, it seems to me, I'd prefer a more thoroughly secular society, of the kind that I imagine exists in many European countries. I say other things equal here because, of course, depending on the content of a particular religion, widespread acceptance of a religion might affect societies in ways that I have strong reason to want. A religion might, for example, provide greater support for egalitarian policies and maybe even for tolerance itself. And they might give me reason to think, on balance, it was a good thing, despite my preference for a secular society, that so many people in my society were, in fact, persuaded by that. But this qualification, other things being equal, with this qualification, it seems to me that I would prefer to live in a more secular society. At least that's how it has seemed to me in the past. I'll return, as I said, to the question of whether I should continue to have this view. But this attitude of mine toward religion, if I have it, and the conflicting attitudes of the American Christians that I first described are concerns of the same kind about the character of our society. It's something I think it's not unreasonable for us to care about, although we have different ideals about what it should be like. So for anyone who has concerns of this kind, as we all do, tolerance of the third kind is a risky policy. The Christians and I both face the same threat, that the balance of individual choices by members of the American public may move the country in a direction that we have reason not to want. I will examine these reasons, both mine and theirs, more fully later in the paper. A third example that I mentioned in my earlier paper concerns norms of dress. I said that I would be unhappy if in 20 years I couldn't go to the beach without being embarrassed by the fact that I was wearing a bathing suit rather than being nude like almost everyone else. I don't think this is actually going to happen to me, but I mention it only to provide a vivid example of the way we have reason to care about the public culture in which we lived. I don't think it's going to happen to me, but the equivalent has actually happened to Muslim women in Europe who want to go to the beach wearing burkinis. They have been subject to public embarrassment and even to legal regulation, which in my view is intolerant and unjust. Prohibiting others from behaving in certain ways because of the effect that their behavior would be likely to have on the public culture of the society is intolerant in this third way. Intolerant policies of this kind might include, for example, restrictions on how people can dress, such as wearing headscarves or failing to wear them, or dressing in a way that reveals too much flesh, and restrictions on the display of religious symbols, perhaps even restrictions on the productions of films, plays, and music that express or call into question certain values. The position I will be defending in this lecture thus differs from Mill's in two ways. I'm now down to, if you're following on the outline, down to number 3. The first way is that, as I've said, I'll be concerned with a kind of tolerance that requires us to permit conduct that does have important effect on others, and therefore can have significant costs. The second difference lies in the moral basis of my defense of tolerance and Mill's. Mill's defense was, at least he claimed, based on his utilitarianism. Mill maintained that people should be allowed to do as they wish in their private lives, in part because allowing this was the policy most likely to promote the greatest amount of happiness. My view of morality is different. As a contractualist, I believe that actions or policies are morally wrong, but principles permitting them can't be justified in a way that gives the reasons that victims of these actions or restrictions have to object to them were given the same weight as the comparable interests of others. This implies that whether something is morally permissible or impermissible depends on the reasons individuals have for wanting to be free to engage in such actions or policies as compared with the reasons others have for objecting to the way they are affected by them. One might put this by saying that actions are morally wrong in this sense if they fail to treat others with respect, where respecting someone is a matter of taking their interests seriously and putting them on a par with the interests of others. Looking at morality in this way, or even accepting this view, would not resolve disagreements about moral right and wrong, because people who disagree about the wrongness of certain actions will also disagree about the nature and strength of the relevant reasons for permitting those actions or for barring them. But what this way of understanding moral wrongness does, I think, is to clarify these disagreements by forcing those on both sides to make explicit and defend their views of the reasons that are in question. Following this strategy serves as a normative microscope, as it were, for examining questions more deeply, not simply as a way of understanding disagreement or diffusing it, but also as a way of gaining deeper understanding into one's own views, possibly leading to changes of mind. Now, applying this view of moral wrongness to the kind of tolerance that Mill was discussing, my view is that when laws restrict what individuals do in private are morally objectionable, this is because those individuals have good reason to reject principles that would permit such laws. People have good reason to want to lead sexual lives of the kind they're drawn to and choose, and good reason to want to be able to follow their own religious conscience. These reasons are, I think, stronger than any reasons that others have to want to be able to restrict such behavior. as long as Mill's principle assumes these practices don't seriously affect other people's lives. So laws of the kind that Mill wanted to rule out are also morally impermissible on my view, not because a policy of tolerance will lead to greater overall happiness, but because a policy of intolerance fails to treat people with respect in the relevant sense. It can't be justified in a way that gives their interests the same weight as the comparable interests of others. Now, this difference between my way of defending tolerance and Mill's way of doing so is not just an abstract question of political philosophy. It's not, as it were, a form of academic product differentiation between consequentialists and deontologists, or at least we're both advertising their brand. It comes up in actual politics, in two related things that are often said about liberalism. One is that liberalism is committed to an unrealistic view that the recognition of individual liberties will lead to the development of a society of the best and most valuable kind. The other, more cynical observation is that liberals' commitment to tolerance is in fact contingent and instrumental. Liberals defend individual rights only because, under present conditions, they see themselves as winning the culture wars in a society in which such rights are widely recognized. Therefore, it is said by people on the right, defenders of religious and traditional views are allowing themselves to be played for fools if they do not also adopt a purely instrumental view of individual rights and liberties. That is to say, adopt the view that these liberties shouldn't be taken seriously if they are leading society to evolve in a less religious and traditional direction. So one of my aims about writing about tolerance is to counter both of these ideas. First, individual rights and liberties, as I've said, are to be respected, not, as Mill might be read to suggest, because their recognition is most likely to lead to the best outcome, but rather because these rights and liberties define a way of living together that we owe to our fellow citizens. Second, because the results of living together on these terms, on the basis of tolerance as I'm describing it, are highly uncertain, a policy of tolerance has serious risks for everyone. Liberals, no less than conservatives and traditionalists, face the risk that tolerance will lead to a society of the kind that they don't want. As I've said, on my view, the case for saying tolerance is something that we owe to each other rests on comparing the reasons individuals have for objecting to intolerance and the reasons that others have for objecting to the costs that tolerance may impose on them. So I now want to consider the reasons on those two sides in somewhat more detail. So I'm now finally made it down to number 4 on your list. Don't lose heart. The rest of this will go a little more quickly than that. Individuals have, I think, at least 2 kinds of reasons to object to intolerance of the third kind I've described. Perhaps there are more which you could call to my attention in the Q&A. First, there are what might be called reasons of integrity. These are reasons to be able to dress and to behave in public in ways that affect one's values, one's sexual orientation, and one's religious commitments. Being denied the right to do this forces people to present themselves in public in ways that are untrue to their sense of who they are and what is important in their lives. Their reasons to object to this kind of forced self-alienation seem to me very strong. They're not, however, the only kind of reasons at stake. People also have what might be called reasons of advocacy, to behave in public in ways that express their personal values, because this is a way of having an effect on the public culture of their society by indicating their presence, calling attention to what they believe, both for those who share their views and also in hopes of influencing others who do not and winning them over to your way of thinking. Now, I've described these 2 kinds of reasons, reasons of integrity and reasons of advocacy, only in vague terms. I think there's a lot more to be said about exactly how we should look at them, and perhaps we'll come back to that in the Q&A. But tolerance, in my view, doesn't require that people be allowed to do just anything that they see as required by their values or as expressing these values. They can be prohibited, for example, from doing things that cause harm to others or their property, or even in some cases, from doing things that cause others severe discomfort or embarrassment. It's not intolerant, for example, I think, to forbid public nudity, or certainly to forbid having sex in the public park, because of the embarrassment that these things would cause to other people. This is because, I think, the reasons people have for wanting to do these things, whether they're reasons of integrity or reasons of advocacy, are not as strong as the reasons that others have for wanting not to have to look at them. In particular, these reasons aren't as strong as the countervailing reasons, because being barred from doing these things leaves people free to advocate for their views in many other ways. Reasons of advocacy aren't necessarily reasons to why you have to advocate in a particular and offensive way. Now, comparative judgments of the kind I just made are not uncontroversial. Some observant Muslim men may complain that having women walk in public with their hair and faces uncovered is distressing to them in just the way that I said public sex or nudity are distressing to others. And others may object that they're distressed or even frightened when dealing with women whose faces are concealed. On my view of morality, however, a defense of a policy of tolerance must be based on claims of this kind, such as that the reasons individuals have to be protected against these reactions of offense, whatever, are weaker than the women's reasons to be able to appear in public in a manner that expresses their values. These claims about reasons are not neutral. They're not neutral between different moral outlooks, in particular not between certain Muslim and Christian outlooks and some secular outlooks on the other hand. But this kind of non-neutrality is not an embarrassment for the doctrine of tolerance. Tolerance of the kind I'm now discussing involves a kind of neutrality insofar as it requires us to give individuals with different values the same opportunity to express those values in public. Like any moral claim, a defense of tolerance has to give equal weight to the comparable reasons of different people. But again, like any moral claim, a defense of tolerance has to be based on substantive claims about the strengths of these different reasons, which will often, as I said, continue to be matters of disagreement. Now, I've just been discussing reasons for restricting individuals' public expressions of their values, which are based on what might be called the immediate experiential impact that these particular acts of expression have on other members of society. I've said that tolerance may, within limits, allow restriction for such reasons. What tolerance of the kind I'm discussing rules out is legal restrictions of public conduct because of its likely effects on the evolution of the society. Here's where neutrality comes in. This is, as I've said, something we all have reason to care about. So I need to look more closely at the reasons we do have to care about this and see how they should be weighed in this calculus. So here we are down to number 6. Reasons of the first kind I want to consider are reasons for preferring a society in which the public culture reflects one's own concerns and values rather than values and customs that one finds alien. People may, as they say, prefer for their society to be and to continue to be one in which others speak their language, share their religion and their styles of dress, their tastes in music and entertainment. This might be put by saying that people have reason to want their society to be one in which they feel at home. But there are several different things that this might mean. One thing people have reason to want is that their society should contain a sufficiently large number of people who share their tastes and values. Reasons of this kind need not depend on views of the objective value of these tastes and practices. A French speaker may believe that French is a superior language to English, but need not believe this in order to have a reason of the kind in question that I'm discussing now to prefer to live in a society in which French is widely spoken. Similarly, chess players need not believe that chess is a superior game to Go in order to want to live in a society where there are many chess players rather than one in which everyone else plays Go. No one can be guaranteed the existence of a community of others who share their tastes and values in this way, however, because the existence of such a group depends on the free choices of other individuals about what language to speak, what religion to follow, and so on. People have what I call reasons of advocacy for expressing their particular values and customs in public, in part because this is a way of promoting or maintaining such a group by influencing others' choices. and a policy that barred some people from doing this simply because it might draw people away from a group that others would like to preserve or promote would be objectionably intolerant in the sense that I'm now discussing. Banning it for this reason would involve giving the interests of some greater weight than the exactly comparable interests of others in having a sufficiently large group of people who think the way they do. Different people's desires for a sufficiently large group of like-minded others can, however, be satisfied at the same time. A well-functioning and desirable society can contain many diverse cultural, linguistic, and religious groups. This thesis is the normative and descriptive core of what's commonly called multiculturalism. This view seems to me entirely correct, even obviously so. But the idea that it's not correct, that we should aim instead or settle for, and the idea that we should aim for or settle for such a society is controversial. I think this is largely because many people want not merely to live in a society in which a sufficient number of others share their language, religion, and other customs and practices, but also to live in a society in which their customs and practices are regarded as the norm for the society, relative to which other customs and practices are generally seen as deviant or inferior. This seems, for example, to be what the American Christians I mentioned earlier have in mind in wanting America to be, as they see it, or to remain, as they see it, a Christian nation. That is, a nation in which being Christian is the norm, expressed in what holidays we observe, and the place that Christian prayer has in schools and national occasions, and so on. Why should people want their particular tastes and values to have this status? It may provide a kind of reassurance and a sense of community to have your values and ways of living affirmed by others. But these benefits are also provided, and I think to a sufficient degree, by a community of like-minded others of the kind I discussed earlier. Why should anyone want beyond this? Even that, as I said, can't be guaranteed, but why would anybody want beyond this to have one's way of life be, in the sense I'm now discussing, the norm of one's society? For example, for it to be widely seen as what it is to even be a member of that society. Unlike merely having a community of like-minded others, this status is something that can't be enjoyed by more than one group at the same time. So, whatever reasons people have for wanting this status, restricting the activities of some in order to provide them with the status can be justified only by giving the members of the other groups reasons for wanting the status less weight than the reasons of the former group. Sorry, I got that bollocksed up, but I think you see what I have in mind. Since no two groups can be the dominant group at the same time, we can justify controlling what some people do in order to preserve dominance only by, at the same time, forcing other people to accept being dominated. Reasons on these two sides are, however, I think, less symmetrical than this description would suggest. When one way of living is widely seen as the norm, this necessarily involves other customs and values being generally viewed with some kind of disapproval, perhaps even as marking those who hold those views as less than full members of the society, in my case, not fully American. Being stigmatized in this way is a significant cost, and the reasons individuals have for wanting not to be stigmatized are stronger than the reasons, whatever they may be, that people have for wanting their way of life to be the norm rather than merely having a community of like-minded others. Now, being seen as out of step with the majority culture of one society is a fate that people can't be guaranteed not to suffer, because it depends, as I said, on the free decisions of others. But restricting the expressive activities of some people in order to preserve the status of other people's way of life as the societal norms would not merely involve giving greater weight to the comparable reasons of the latter group, it would involve taking their reasons for wanting to have this status to outweigh what seemed to me to be the stronger reasons of others not to be stigmatized as less than fully members of their society. Now, in my previous paper on tolerance, and earlier in this lecture, I said that other things equal, I would prefer to live in a society that was less religious than the United States has been in my lifetime, and even than it is today. Reflecting on that preference, however, it seems to me that what I was most objecting to was the cost I've just mentioned. That is to say, the cost of living in a society in which being religious, and in our society that mainly meant being Christian, was seen as the norm and seen as part of what it was to be fully American. Leaving that aside, and assuming that I had a sufficient community of fellow non-believers, how much reason would I have to care about what the beliefs of my fellow citizens in matters of religion were? It seems to me that I would have little reason as long as they were tolerant and regarded non-believers like me as full citizens, equally entitled to shape the culture of our society. So, following my general strategy of investigating the reasons behind moral views, I reached the conclusion that I may have been mistaken in my earlier paper, and even in this paper, in saying initially that, other things equal, I had strong reason to prefer living in a less religious society. I was led to think that I had such reasons, perhaps, because I was really imagining cases in which other things were not equal. But if I filter out those things, if I filter out actually being held not to be a full member of the society, and I count myself as having a secure community of like-minded others, why should I care about the opinions that other people hold? I think maybe I was exaggerating that for the wrong reasons. What I've just argued, however, should not be taken to mean that people never have sufficient reason to want certain attitudes to be regarded as the norm in their society, and for opposing views to be strongly disapproved of by most people. Because there are, I think, good reasons to want principles of tolerance themselves to have exactly this status. We can understand these reasons as reasons to want what Jeremy Waldron calls in his book, The Harm in Hate Speech, dignity. To have dignity in the sense Waldron discusses is to be recognized as, here's Waldron's words, as social equals and bearers of human rights and constitutional entitlements. Dignity in this sense requires two things. The first is the social fact that the view that one has the status of being equal is generally held and regarded as the norm, denial of which is seen as importantly mistaken by most of one's fellow citizens. That's a social fact that's required for me to have dignity in Waldron's sense. Second, to have dignity as Waldron understands it, one must also have justified confidence that this social fact obtains. I will return below to the question of what can or must be done to provide people with dignity in this sense. My first concern, though, is with the reasons people have to want it, in particular with how the reasons that people have to want dignity-conferring attitudes to be the norm in their society are different from their reasons to want their religion or other values to have this status, right? I said that we don't have any good reason to want our religion to be our style of dress to be the norm beyond the minimum that I mentioned. So what's different about this case? Let's look at the two elements of dignity in Waldron's sense. To lack the first element of dignity is the social fact element, is to lack a relationship with one's fellow citizens, a relationship of mutual equality that I think is in itself something we have strong reason to want. In addition, more instrumentally, lacking this element in dignity would leave one vulnerable to being denied political rights and social opportunities that one needs in order to pursue almost any of one's aims in life. So one has both, as it were, intrinsic and instrumental reasons to want to have dignity in this first aspect of Waldron's sense. This is quite different from the reasons we might have to want one's other values to be the norm in one's society. While one might wish to share a bond of religious belief or other values with all of one's fellow citizens, having many or at least most of them reject one's views doesn't have serious consequences of the kind I've just described. Moreover, having tolerant views be the norm in a society doesn't declare anyone to have inferior status. Tolerant views, by definition, affirm the equal status, equal in legal, constitutional, and moral rights of everyone in the society. In a society in which the dignity of all is respected, those who reject intolerance are widely seen as mistaken in an important way, but they still retain their basic rights and are seen as entitled to those rights. I'll return below, however, to this question of what's involved in tolerating the intolerant. Before doing that, I need to say a word about tolerance and relativism. Now we are down to number 8, so you can have hope that this lecture will soon be over. I've argued that the reasons different people in a society have for wanting their particular values to be widely shared, except for reasons for wanting their society to be a tolerant one, have equivalent weight in justifying laws regulating the behavior that expresses their outlook. This equivalence is easy to accept in some cases, such as chess and Go, perhaps, but there are other cases in which it might be called into question. My reasons for preferring that my society be one in which many people speak my particular language or play the sports that I enjoy need not depend on the view that my language and sports are objectively better than others. But in other cases, my reasons for wanting my society to have a particular character does depend on objective values. I said earlier, for example, that I'd prefer to live in a society that gave less importance to sex and sexual attractiveness than is prevalent in current American culture. I would prefer this because I believe that these prevailing values are, on objective grounds, mistaken. If my views for preferring such a society with different attitudes toward sex are based on objective values, how can I see the reasons that others have to want to preserve this aspect or even increase it, aspect of our culture, as reasons that are on a par with my reasons for wanting to change it? If the justification for tolerance rested on the view that our reasons of this kind are always morally on a par with those we disagree with, then tolerance would seem to involve an objectionable form of relativism. But tolerance does not require us to take such a view. It does not require us in our private lives and public behavior to see other people's views about what our society should be like as on a par with our own. Quite the contrary, it leaves us free to oppose the influence of views that we see as mistaken by advocating our own view of what our society should be like. What tolerance rules out is just taking the fact that certain views are mistaken as a reason for legally restricting behavior that advocates or manifests them. The difficult and important question is why one should accept this limitation on the reasons we should take into account in deciding what laws we should have and how we should vote regarding such matters. The answer, I think, is this. What is ultimately at stake in these cases, what I've been calling the nature of our society, is a collective product. It's the result of what we all individually believe and how we behave in our public lives. Our collective behavior, manifesting our particular values and outlooks, is thus a kind of informal politics, a process like voting through which we collectively determine what our society will be like. Tolerance of the kind I'm discussing concerns the moral defensibility of laws limiting participation in this informal political process. What's special about the reasons that tolerance excludes is that they are reasons for restricting participation in a process of collective decision-making based on beliefs about what the outcome of that very process itself should be. Allowing these reasons to count in determining what one can do in public would be like allowing the fact that certain people are likely to vote for the wrong party to count in favor of measures that would make it more difficult for them to vote. In my country, it seems right now that some people are trying to do that in the actual politics case, but I won't go down that road. So accepting tolerance means accepting that the character of our society is a common product that we all have the same claim to participate in determining. This is compatible with believing that we can have good reason, based perhaps on the objective correctness of our values, for wanting our society to reflect those values. That is to say, wanting this to come about by our fellow citizens coming to hold these values by voting for them, as it were, with their minds, their feet, and their tongues. Okay, tolerance and the intolerant. Number 9. Tolerance is needed because we disagree about what our society should be like. It's an answer to the question of what the process, as I've just said, through which this matter is settled should morally be like. But people also disagree about this very question, that is, the question of tolerance. Some may hold the view that our society should be less tolerant, less open to being shaped by the values of others with whom they disagree. In particular, they may deny that the interests of members of certain groups should be taken into account in determining what our laws and policies should be. A further question that's often asked about those to whom tolerance is owed is whether we must tolerate those who hold such views. Stated briefly, my answer is that if tolerating these people means just that they are legally permitted to express and argue for their views in public, I think the answer is yes, they must be tolerated. But this does not mean that their views must be tolerated in the sense of being regarded as reasonable and acceptable opinions. Why do I think this? I reach this answer, again, by trying to identify clearly the reasons that individuals have for objecting to various policies. In this case, it's important to distinguish between reasons based on what Waldron calls dignity and reasons based on insult of the kind I discussed earlier, or offense of the kind I discussed earlier in my lecture. Recall that dignity in Waldron's sense has two elements. The first element is the social factor of widespread recognition as social equals and bearers of human rights and constitutional entitlements. And the second element is justified confidence that this is the case, that confidence that one is generally recognized by one's fellow citizens as having this status. Now, in order for norms to be generally accepted in the way that's required in order to provide the first element of dignity, these norms, I think, have to be open to discussion. Disputes about what these norms allow, arguments for modifying, because they're always somewhat unclear, arguments for modifying them, or even arguments for rejecting them altogether, cannot, I think, be outlawed. In order for them to have the status of genuine norms, they have to be disputable. Direct personal insult, on the other hand, such as calling individuals derogatory names or telling them, "You don't belong here, go back where you came from," could, I think, at least in principle, be made illegal. This is so for two kinds of reasons. One is the particularly strong reason that people have not to want to be subject to direct treatment of this kind. These are strong, I think, at least as strong as reasons for objecting to public sex. A second is that, as in that example, these insults can be barred while still leaving the intolerant plenty of other opportunities for expressing their objections to norms of tolerance in other ways. The remaining question is whether permitting arguments for intolerant policies at all threatens the second aspect of dignity of those whose status is called into question. That is to say, threatens their justified confidence that they are widely viewed as full members of the society. But what's required to support this confidence is that denials that some people have this status, when they occur, are strongly rejected in public in a way that elicits wide support. The task of supporting dignity by providing this kind of assurance is one that belongs to all of us. We have to speak up against intolerance. We can't just outsource the defense of tolerance to a law banning the expression of intolerant views. It's up to us to provide it. To conclude, I focus on a form of intolerance which requires us to permit public conduct by others that can have important effects on the character of the society in which we live. To understand why tolerance of this kind is morally required, I've investigated, on the one hand, the reasons we have for caring about the character of our society, and on the other, the reasons people have for wanting to be free to engage in conduct that affects it. Among reasons of the former kind, I distinguish between reasons to want one's society to contain a sufficient number of like-minded others, and reasons to want one's way of life and values to be the norm in one's society, relevant to which others are generally seen as deviant, or even marked as not full members. I've argued that people do not in general have good reasons of the latter sort, and certainly that these reasons would be weaker than the reasons other people have not to be excluded by norms of this sort. The exception, I argued, is that there are good reasons to want tolerance itself to be the norm in one's society. And in support of this, I've drawn on Jeremy Waldron's idea of the importance of providing dignity for citizens. And using this, I've examined the ways in which we should tolerate the intolerant and ways in which we should not do so. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Scanlon, for the wonderful lecture. we now have time for some questions for Professor Scanlon. If anyone would like to ask a question, they could go to the Q&A tab and click on Ask a Question. Perhaps while people are gathering their thoughts, I could go ahead and kick things off with a question. So, Professor Scanlon, I know you've spoken a bit in the past about the potential implications of your views on tolerance for real life issues such as immigration in particular. And I was wondering if you'd be interested in saying a bit about the potential implications there.
Well, this, if I were to go into that subject, would give people lots of time to think up questions and no time to ask them. But to be brief, I mean, immigration is an enormously complicated subject, but the reason it came up was having recognized, I thought, that people have, all of us have good reason to care about what I call the character of our society. I then started worrying, well, could people appeal to that as a reason for wanting to have a more restrictive immigration policy? I found that very disturbing. I didn't like that. So I want to look into say, well, what do my conclusions say about that? Well, first is that one of the things I pointed out in the lecture is that our reasons for caring about the character of our society are mainly reasons for wanting to have a sufficient community of like-minded others. That's something that's not threatened by immigration, right? It's an idea about the uniformity of one society that's threatened by immigration. So at least I've argued that reason isn't a very strong reason. But it still worries me that I'm inclined to think it's not really a good reason at all to want our society to be homogeneous. I'm inclined to think it isn't. But then I had the following thought experiment. I mean, suppose, let's just imagine for the moment that some decision about immigration policy, say whether to allow certain kinds of visas and something like that, is morally open, that it would be permissible to go either way. Maybe there are no such open questions, but let's assume that, right? In that case, I think that one reason I might have for wanting to be in favor of a more permissive policy would be that it would make our society more diverse, which I think would be a good thing. But if I think that's at least an eligible reason, how can I say that somebody else's reason to want our society to be more uniform, to remain more uniform, isn't an eligible reason? So that idea of possible parity in this situation, I also found disturbing. So what should I say about that? I think that the appearance of distress there was a result on my part of confusing two different kinds of questions, two different kinds of dispute. One is the dispute between me, who would like a more diverse America, and my fellow citizens who would like a more uniform America, right? So in that debate is to say we each ought to have equal opportunity to make our arguments, right? But the question of whether I have reason to favor a more restrictive immigration policy has to take into account what I owe to the immigrants, right? So a reason for restricting immigration faces a much higher bar than a reason for wanting to be permissive. So the kind of symmetry that I imagine between these two kinds of reasons actually holds as a domestic matter between who's eligible to take part in the discourse, right? But it doesn't hold as a moral matter on the question of immigration policy. About immigration policy, I've read about it, and it's a difficult question. Certainly, I think the United States ought to have a much more generous immigration policy than it does. It's unconscionable that we're so restrictive about immigration. But exactly what the situation ought to be is something I don't have a full answer to.
Well, thanks very much. That was a really well thought out, excellent response. We have a question now from Ben Sachs, so I'll just go ahead and read this out, and I'll publish it now so you can see it in the chat as well. So Ben Sachs, who's senior lecturer here, he asks, which entities should be tolerant? The kind of intolerance you're talking about is prohibition of certain sorts of behavior. Okay, so that means we're talking about entities that have the ability to prohibit things, but that's a lot of entities. Let's start at the top. Presumably, you'd say that sovereign states should be tolerant. Okay, what about municipalities? Semi-self-governing isolationist sects like the Amish and various Native American tribes, businesses, families, etc. All these entities have the power to enact prohibitions on their members.
Good question. Hard to answer. I was talking about, as it were, political entities, which would include not only the nation state, but also states and municipalities, whose right to rule has to be defended in a particular way, right? They claim a right to rule based on what they're doing for us and the way they're treating us and so on. So there's a moral basis for what they can claim to do, and I'm placing limits on what they can do that would have that moral basis. Corporations, say universities, organizations, to a certain extent, you can love them or leave them. That is, they can withhold or generate certain provide or benefit certain benefits, so the basis for restrictions on what they can do are different. Depending on what they're trying to do, there may be restrictions. For example, in the case of universities, given what universities are supposed to do, various forms of academic freedom follow. That is, that the trustees can't tell the professors what to teach, because there's no point in having professors if the trustees are telling them what to teach, right? So there's an internal logic of a certain kind of tolerance that flows from the structure of the university and how such an institution is defended. Whether particular political parties have to be tolerant, well, that's a whole other question. They want to exclude people who don't follow the party line. Maybe in order to be a political party, you have to be able to do that. So the answer is going to be different depending on, as it were, the foundation of the authority of the entity in question.
Okay, we now have a question from Anuj Puri. Anuj asks, he says, thank you for the wonderful talk. Says, your view of tolerance seems to have a lot in common with Raz's interest theory of rights. X has a right if and only if X can have rights, and other things being equal, an aspect of X's well-being, his interest, is a sufficient reason for holding some other persons to be under a duty. Would you agree that one's duty to tolerate another's interest is akin to one's obligation to respect another's rights? If not, can you please give examples where interests which ought to be tolerated should not be respected as rights?
Thanks. I said earlier that the difference between a consequentialist and a deontological or contractualist defense of tolerance might seem to be mere academic product differentiation. And I think my view of rights is so close to Raz's, although I think there are differences, that for me to elaborate the difference between my view and Raz's would be mere academic product differentiation at this point. So what I'm basically claiming, because my idea of what a right is a right is a limitation on people's discretion. A right is a limitation on the entitlement of some actor, which could be an individual or collective actor, the discretion to act, which is necessary in order to protect the interests of some people, and it can be done in a way that doesn't impose excessive costs on other people. Right? That's kind of a mouthful, but it's quite close to Raz's. And so what I'm arguing here is that there's a right to tolerance. So thank you.
Okay, up next, we have a question from Professor John Haldane. John writes, these arguments appeal to certain moral and political ideas, but there is an issue of social cohesion that raises the question of the degree to which society can endure where it lacks broad agreement on substantive non-formal values. So one might wonder whether the arguments for toleration are in fact parasitic upon a degree or history of communality that cannot be sustained by the present arguments.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Haldane. While I have the microphone, I'll just observe that I very much enjoyed watching Professor Haldane's Knox lecture of a few years ago, and I wish I could have his admirable clarity and calmness of expression. Well, the answer to this question may be we're about to find out, I think, in my country anyway. It's an empirical question, what's required for stability? There is a kind of tension here, I think, within the views of my admired philosopher Chuck Taylor. Professor Taylor, the father of multiculturalism, once said in a talk, when I heard him, that he proposed multiculturalism not necessarily as a political theory, but as a political proposal about a policy that might succeed in holding the Canadian nation together. This was at a time when it was riven with conflicts between Anglophone and Francophone and other elements. Although I've found this attention in Taylor's view, I've never had a chance to ask him about this, because I've read other papers by him in which he put forward the negative thesis that I take to be behind Professor Haldane's question, which is the idea that you can't have a stable society based simply on acceptance of tolerance. We're all in this together. We're in the project of creating this collective culture, and we're all entitled to shape it. And that's our whole basic commitment. Beyond that, we disagree in various ways, but that's the thing that ties us together, rather than any particular identity of other sort. Our only identity is a civic identity, right? And Taylor, in several things I've read by him, says that's not going to work. You're not going to have stability unless people have a more substantial basis. I find there are two Taylors here. I want to be with the multicultural Taylor. But as to whether one could have a stable society, when I mentioned multiculturalism, I said that a society in which people have all these different religions, languages, and so on is both feasible and desirable. And then I said, this is the descriptive and normative core of what's called multiculturalism. Well, the normative core is my desire to live that way, the reasons I recognize for wanting to live that way. The descriptive core is the idea that this is a possible society. I hope that it is. Now, maybe by saying that, I'm imposing a kind of a false imagined American history, according to which that was what the founding of our country was like. I don't know. But as I say, I'd like to think that, but I'm worried in my own country that we're about to find out whether that's right or not, possibly at some cost to ourselves. I hope that addressed Professor Haldane's question.
We have one other question in the queue, so if folks have further questions, we have a little bit more time. But this question, it's from an anonymous member of the audience. It's a quick one, but a difficult sounding one. How does one think about whether or not reasons for objecting to conduct are stronger than reasons for engaging in it?
Good question. Goes to the heart of my view, very, very appropriate, by thinking about it, I think. I found when I got into philosophy, I didn't quite know what I was doing as a philosopher, but 50 years and more in, I find that what I'm doing is that I'm an explorer and mapper of the normative domain. I spend my days trying to identify various things that seem to me to be reasons, and whether they are sufficient reasons, that is stronger reasons than others in certain circumstances or not. How do I decide that? Well, I start with how it seems to me, but then I have to say, well, maybe I'm missing something. That's what I did. That's what I did in my example about Christianity. I thought, I'd really rather not live, having grown up in society in the American Middle West, where Christianity was really dominant, and I was one of the few. I certainly was the only atheist family in my classroom. I felt it was somewhat oppressive, right? But so I thought I'd rather live in a more secular society. But when I start looking at that, what do I really have reason to care about? Maybe I only have reason to care about religion having a certain kind of normative status, which is a different thing from caring about how many of my fellow citizens are religious of one way or another. So that's the way I decide how strong a reason I have, by trying to consider, well, what does my sense that it is a strong reason really depend on? I start varying certain things and testing whether it seems to stand up or not. That's the best I can do.
Well, I have a question for you, Professor Scanlon. Seems like your contractualist view will have particular implications for tolerance that depend on the stance that it takes toward aggregation. So like the claims of many, if they're weak, can't outweigh just one very strong claim, I think is one sort of implication of your contractualist picture that you nicely illustrate with the transmitter room case. And I was just wondering if, if you think that taking different lines in this sort of debate, which, as you know, is still raging, would have interestingly different implications for the contractualist approach to tolerance.
Well, if I'm Captain Ahab, the problem of aggregation is my white whale. I fear that it may get the best of me before I die. But that's a great question. Let me give an example of how that might come up. I said that it's intolerant to prevent people from having a certain opportunity, say expressing their views in public, when other people's reasons for not wanting to be faced with that aren't very strong, like being confronted with public sex or something, but are just kind of mild, disagreement or not liking it very much. But if there are a whole lot of them, why don't they all add up, right? Why don't the mild discomfort that millions of my fellow Americans feel based on the way I speak about Christianity amount up to the equivalent of somebody feeling terribly assaulted by that. So this is just transferring into the public domain the famous example of there's enough very brief headaches could add up to a reason not to save someone's life if the choice was between saving the person's life and preventing a sufficiently large number of 10-second headaches. Okay, so you're right that aggregation would be a problem in this area. Do I have a solution after all these years to the problem of aggregation? I don't. I'm still worrying about it. The best I can say is this. Why does it seem that all these very small things might add up to outweigh what had first seemed a stronger reason, right? Well, when I made that seem to be the case, I converted the reason, stating it in the form of a reason that people have, they just don't want me to do it, into an experience, right, of discomfort, right? And then I added up all those experiences of discomfort, right? So I interpreted the normative basis of what we're dealing with here as what Sidgwick calls a mathematical whole, which has parts that are equally valuable wherever they occur and which add up, right? Now that move toward aggregation was also present in my transmitter room case, right, where what was at issue was the enjoyment that a whole lot of people would miss out on if they were deprived of 5 minutes of watching the NBA finals or the World Cup. Somebody in a book criticized me for mentioning the World Cup, saying that I was hostile to soccer. Whereas, in fact, the reason why I mentioned the World Cup was because there's so many more people watch it than the World Series. But anyway, I won't go there. But the general point is that the problem of aggregation is how to rule out what seem like crazy cases of aggregation, at least to me, while admitting that there could be a strong case for saving 100 people rather than saving one. Other things equal, as they say, right? One thing that makes implausible aggregation more plausible, seem plausible, is shifting into the experiential mode. So that's shifting from reasons, it now seems to me in my latest thinking like this, that's shifting from reasons as the basic coin into some kind of experience as the basic coin. So the question is, if you keep reasons as the basic coin, I have a strong reason not to want to be humiliated in a certain way, or not to be denied the opportunity to live according to my religion, whatever it might be. And a lot of other people have have some reason they don't want to be distracted by it or something like that. And you just look at that as a reason rather than as a bad thing to happen in the world. It's not so clear that they add up. There's a normative question there about, I've said that it's disrespectful to people not to treat their reasons of comparable weight as having the same significance as the comparable reasons of others. Well, here we have a problem of treating my reasons at the same weight as it were the initially non-comparable relations of individuals. So the question is, when does multiplying the number of individuals make the reasons comparable? Now, I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm inclined to think that an answer, a theoretical solution to the question of aggregation, would lie in that dimension. And at least moving into that dimension, even though it doesn't provide you with an answer, it at least provides you with a way of separating off the intuitive pull toward what seemed like the craziest cases. It seemed to me that way. I know that some people don't think they're crazy, but that way. So you have to avoid, when you invited me, Theron, to give this lecture, I initially intended to give us a lecture on the good, which I'm still working on, but I've just given you an outline of what would be the final section of that paper were I to finish it.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, if we get you here in person, maybe you could deliver that paper. That would be lovely. We now have a question from Sarah Brody, Professor Sarah Brody. Sarah writes, all three biblical religions have some strongly universalist elements, as well as much else. Shouldn't religion be encouraged rather than merely tolerated, so that people develop a love of human beings as such, rather than merely toleration of those unlike ourselves?
Well, it's nice to have the chance to say hello to Professor Brody. I've been a colleague in the past. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming, Sarah. I guess it's easy to give a short answer to that question, which is yes, of course. I mean, this bears on the controversial element of the doctrines of my former colleague John Rawls, who said that a society could be, this in a way goes back to a solution to Professor Haldane's question, right? Rawls was interested in how a society founded on liberal values could be stable. And that would be, would enough people of different religious views be willing to accept the norm? And he argued, well, many religions won't, some will, but there will be enough of them. It's not completely unrealistic to suppose there might be enough of them that would, under conditions of individual freedom, have a liberal core, as it were. And in discussing that, he discussed the case of Roman Catholicism, and he mentioned that Vatican II was in effect an argument about whether Roman Catholicism, in one dimension, should be understood as involving a universalistic commitment of the sort that would lead toward tolerance of the kind I'm imagining, or whether it should take a more sectarian turn. And Rawls mentioned this as a positive sign, as I think exactly as Professor Brody said. Look, within many religions, it's not clear whether they have a tolerant core or not. It's not, from reading the Bible or from reading the works of Thomas Aquinas, it may not be settled. It's an open question. So the answer, to go back to Professor Brody's question, is yes, of course. I think it's important to encourage people within all these groups to try to move their views in a more in a more tolerant universalist direction. When I said earlier in my little, after I described my difference from Mill and described different views of liberalism, and said that some people on the right in the United States are saying, look, liberals only support individual rights because they think that'll make them win. So we should just feel free to reject that because insofar as that's going to cause us to lose. I was actually practically quoting a lecture by a so-called integralist in the current Catholicism, which is basically an anti-Vatican II view. So that's, people do argue that, and I think I'm with Professor Brody in thinking it's important that the ambiguity within the doctrine should be, if possible, resolved in a more tolerant direction, although there's going to be disagreement about it, as we see, between integralists and universalists within Catholicism, and I'm sure within other groups as well.
Okay, so now we have a question from Adam Ettinson, who's the senior lecturer here. He says, take a concrete example from the United States. Should a society tolerate intolerant private behavior that might not be openly insulting, but nonetheless express discriminatory attitudes? For example, when a baker refuses to bake a cake for a homosexual couple.
Right. Well, I've thought about that. That's not private behavior. I mean, that is public. It's a commercial interaction that he's refusing to have. This, and on the whole, I'm inclined to think that the bakers in Masterpiece Cake Shop don't have a very good case. But it goes back to a point I mentioned earlier, back in section 4 of my outline, where I said referred to reasons of integrity and reasons of advocacy. And I said people have reasons of integrity to want to behave in public in a way that's consistent with and not contrary to their own commitments. Now, you can see the Masterpiece Cake Shop as an attempt to, expand the demands of integrity. We're getting a lot of this in so-called other religious liberty arguments in the United States, to say being true to our religion requires a whole lot. So you have to expand. So reasons of integrity can, I think, be reasons to be allowed to behave in public, but reasons of integrity can't be simply a get out of jail free card. That is, I can just define the boundaries of what's required by my integrity as broadly as I want. So I'm not totally clear what the ups and downs are in that case, but I just want to say that it's a case of public behavior, number one, and it's a case where one has to ask, well, what's the cost of preventing people from behaving publicly in that way, and how are they restricted? I think it's not. Anyway, I'll just put it that way. That's a question about how reasons of integrity and reasons of advocacy are interpreted and therefore weighed. So this goes back to the question about weighing. I have to think about, well, that's a reason of integrity. What kinds of reasons of integrity can we take into account? In order to be taken into account in justifying laws, reasons such as reasons of integrity or advocacy have to be universalizable and institutionalizable. Universalizable means we have to count everybody's reasons of that kind with the same weight. Institutionalizable means we have to consider what the consequences would be of giving everybody's reasons of that kind the same weight, right? Would that really mean that some people are not able to buy anything in the marketplace or whatever? So those are the two lines of argument or two lines of thinking that I would go down. I'm not quite clear about the case, but that's as far as I can get. But thanks for the question.
Okay, we have a question from an anonymous member of the audience, and they ask, is tolerance only an attitude an individual can have towards different things at different points in time? Might we not call tolerance a virtue one has generally, or merely certain patterns of behavior? Or is it possibly a combination of these things?
I'm sorry, I think I didn't understand the question. Maybe you could repeat it and I'll try again.
So is tolerance only an attitude an individual can have toward different things at different points in time? Might we not call tolerance a virtue one has generally, or merely certain patterns of behavior? Or is it like a combination of these things?
Well, I guess I'll take combination for 50 pounds. I would say it's an attitude one has in general, which is expressed in one's reaction to particular things at particular moments. But yeah, I would say I would go for the virtue. Although I'm not a virtue theorist, I would say yes, tolerance is a virtue, a tendency one has in general to react in certain ways. Although I've been more concerned with tolerance as a matter of public policy rather than as an individual virtue, but that's what I would say.
Okay, so we have 2 questions left and 3 minutes, so I'll just read them out really quickly, and maybe, Tim, you could give just a quick responses, and then we'll wrap up. So one is from Ben Sachs. He says, does your argument for tolerance extend to practices or beliefs that aren't central to anyone's way of life or conception of the good? And then we have a question from Olympia, says, do you think the judges or courts have a role in promoting the tolerance in a divided society?
I think the answer to the question is yes, both. And to Ben's question, could you give me Ben's question again quickly? What was Ben's question?
So Ben asks, does your argument for tolerance extend to practices or beliefs that aren't central to anyone's way of life or conception of the good?
Well, the case for tolerance depends on people's reasons for wanting to behave in certain ways that might be restricted. So I focused on people's ways of life and conceptions of the good because A, people have particularly strong reasons to want to behave those ways, and second, because they tend to be controversial. So if something else had that structure, that is, it's something I have very much strong reason to want to do, and it's controversial, then we might need tolerance in that dimension, but I haven't thought of one.
Well, I think that's probably all the time we have today. I'm afraid we should just stop there, but wow, what an event. You've just heard an important, clear, and deeply insightful Knox lecture by one of the best and most influential living moral philosophers. So we're just incredibly lucky to have had Professor Tim Scanlon give this year's Knox lecture, albeit virtually rather than in person. And as Principal Sally Mapstone said, hopefully we can have him here in person at some point in the near future. But for now, I hope you'll join me in giving Professor Scanlon our sincere thanks.
Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure.